Falcha, here we are, part 3, the dawn of everything. Little light reading for a late November evening. God, it's almost December. Ugh. Okay, now we're going to talk about unfreezing the Ice Age. This is chapter 3. Objectively, the true events in the past, who first made fire, who came up with the idea first of marriage, who kept the first pets. You can get stories about that, origin stories from us in much the same way that the Romans and the Greeks explained the past through mythology. The stories that we have for these sorts of events are as mythological as their take on things. Distant times provide us with a huge canvas for our fantasies. I mean, they're so far away and it's so difficult to conceptualize that we get really creative. And we have many misconceptions. So, for example, Christians believed the book of Genesis, literally. And up till the 19th century, men of letters, including scientists, assumed that the entire universe did not exist before late October 4004 BC. I don't know why that date, but oh well. They believed that all people in the world spoke Hebrew until the Tower of Babel was invented. They didn't have prehistory. Prehistory was not a concept. It was something that was begun to be referred to in 1858 when a discovery was made at the Brixham Cave in Devon in England, when they found stone axes with the remains of extinct animals, and they said, oh, there were people. And this really shook up archaeology because they had no idea. They did not know that there were people who could make tools. So prehistory is a long time. We're talking 3 million years. And there are huge gaps where we have little or absolutely no evidence of anything. And it's tempting to fill in the gaps. I mean, why not? Let's make a story. It's always more fun than a big vacuum. For example, the story of Mitochondrial Eve. Now, this is something that I heard, and I didn't know this is not a thing. In the 1980s, it was assumed that there was a common ancestor, maybe 120,000 years ago. And this is supported by Paleolithical skulls in the Eastern African Rift Valley. This was a theory that was debated by scientists, but it was grabbed in the popular imagination. People thought, oh, this is the mother of all people, and that must be the Garden of Eden, and it's the incubator of humanity. And today, there's a completely different scientific take on the whole thing. For most of evolutionary history, our ancestors were all over Africa, not in just one place, and that many of these groups were isolated by tens of thousands of years from each other by geography. And as a result, strong regional traits developed, and we are very much the same as each other as we are to them. And we have small cosmetic differences today from each other, the same as they did. And the differences in human beings are just cosmetic. They're, skin color, shapes of some few things, but you're still the same. And in the past, regional populations were much more diverse. And so what the point they're making is there was no mitochondrial Eve, that we're the result of a mosaic of different groups. And the only thing that's absolutely 100% certain is that we did come from Africa. Which group? There is no one particular group that's responsible. We're a mishmash. And as populations moved and out of Africa into Eurasia, they interbred. And they were still very different from what we are today up till around 40,000 BC. And the flora and fauna that they lived with was also very different. It's really hard to imagine. And you can imagine anything you want because there's very little concrete evidence to contradict what you come up with. And there's not nearly enough evidence to speculate about what kind of societies they had. I mean, there's just no way. We know that they were physically diverse because we found remnants, and we know that their environments had to be extremely diverse, and so that therefore there was no one original form of human society. So the assumption that we all started out as small migrating bands of family clans that are innocent is baloney. And there was no Garden of Eden. There was no single Mitochondrial Eve. So this leads us to a discussion of the Sapien paradox. About 500,000 years ago, we attained our present basic genetic uniformity. And the first evidence of complex human behavior or culture dates back to about 100,000 years ago. The evidence we have depends not on where this happens, it depends on the luck of the preservation of it and the willingness of modern governments to do archaeology. So you can't take archaeological evidence and say, look, this proves anything about culture. And what it proves is that it was this particular way at this particular place. We don't know what else is out there because there's so little research that has been done. And things like rock buildups around the coasts trap evidence, so that's where they find evidence. Not because that's where the only evidence was, it's where it gets trapped. It gets washed down and trapped at rock accumulations. So you'll find a lot of tools and weapons. That doesn't mean there were a lot of hunters and fighters there. It means that things got washed down from elsewhere. And it's just luck what we find. And this creates a bias in the theories that we have about human development. So most historical theories about all of this are based on spotty, inconsistent, and inadequate evidence. Today we understand this better, that we've been fooled by the discovery of evidence in just a few places. The theory was, that's the Sapien paradox, the theory was that there was an upper Paleolithic revolution 45,000 years ago in Europe when Neanderthals were replaced by Homo sapiens. And the first clear evidence of hunting, toolkits, handicrafts, images, figurines, carved figures, cave paintings, more elaborate clothing, body decorating, musical instruments, exchanging of raw materials over long distances, and the first evidence of social inequality, which they extrapolate from the rare, isolated, grand burial. One person, they'll find bones, and then they'll find one really elaborate burial. And from that, they extrapolate that there must have been social inequality. Either this person was honored, or a noble, or a leader, or remarkable, or maybe feared. The gap between the appearance of humans and the first evidence of culture is called the Sapien paradox. There's this inexplicable gap that they don't know what happened. There were even suggestions, theories at one point, that there was a sudden brain mutation that made people smart and then suddenly have culture, because how could smart people exist without evidence of culture? Well, it's easy to explain. We now know that European archaeological evidence is rich. It didn't all just suddenly explode in Europe, but that it's rich in Europe because that's where the governments fund the research. And European societies have been studying the prehistory of Europe for a very long time. That doesn't mean that Europeans were smarter than early people anywhere else. It just means that that's where we've learned. We've focused on that. So every year now, there's more and more evidence of early behavioral complexity everywhere. And for example, beads and pigments have just been discovered in a Kenyan cave that are 60,000 years old. And they used to think there was nothing there, no culture there. There was a cave art in Borneo that's thousands of years older than the caves at Lascaux and Altamira. So these Spanish and French caves that are supposed to be so unique and remarkable, we just found something thousands of years older than that. We just hadn't looked there before. 45,000 years ago, actually, the Europeans did it all later than this other stuff. Europe was thinly populated, and people coexisted with Neanderthals who had their own social complexity, which is a whole other book. So any cultural growth then probably had more to do with things like climate and demographics, like ice sheets and herd movements because of the ice coverage that drew people into Europe following the herds. And they were limited to small geographical areas with dense populations because they couldn't go anywhere else because of the ice. And therefore, culture grew more in those spots. It doesn't mean they were smarter or better or anything else. It just means it's the kind of the situation that fate threw at them. The archaeology of the Upper Paleolithic between 50 and 15,000 BC contradicts history's theory of small egalitarian forager bands. So now they're finding more and more evidence that argues with this earlier belief system. Anyone not a Pleistocene archaeologist continues to act like the innocent primordial hunter-gatherer is a fact, but these archaeologists are beginning to realize, whoops, we were wrong. So there's an evolutionary anthropologist named Christopher Bohm who says that history believes that people were either innately hierarchical, that's the Hobbesian thing, or innately egalitarian, and that's the Rousseauian thing. He says that humans do have instinctive tendencies to engage in dominance and submissive behavior because of our simian ancestry, but we're distinctly human in our ability to decide not to act that way. I think that's called free will. He studied early groups and he saw tactics to collectively mold group behavior. He saw instances, examples of ridicule, shame, and shunning. Also saw examples where people who were out of control, like sociopaths, were killed off. And there are no similar kinds of behaviors that have ever been recorded in other primates. This is a Homo sapien behavior. He said that the instinct to bully is a strategy of manipulation, but counter-bullying is not an instinct. That's something that actually is thought. It displays actual intelligence. These bands can imagine what their societies would be like if they did things differently. So it's the essence of politics. They're able to extrapolate, oh, if we let this continue, this bad stuff is going to happen. So the ability to reflect on different social pathways and outcomes and to argue one over another is distinctly a human thing. Aristotle said that humans are political animals, and that's exactly right. So therefore, wouldn't various groups of early people have explored a variety of social arrangements and tried something and, oh, well, we don't like this, or tried something else and said, well, we do like this, but look at them, they do this and we don't want to be like them, and so they intentionally choose to be very different. Lots of variables, lots of different possibilities. Bohm, the researcher, suggests that all societies chose to be egalitarian for thousands of years, and for some reason they flipped to hierarchical with agriculture. So genetic nature is sort of a Hobbesian point of view. Man is inherently competitive, and political history is kind of Rousseauian. They're just positing this idea. And then nothing different happened for tens of thousands of years. Is that true? But recent finds in archaeology give evidence that says otherwise. So, what's that evidence? They found hunter-gatherer burials. So, all across Western Europe, they found isolated burials of individuals or very small groups. But they were highly decorated, and they were posed, and had lavish, valuable ornamentation, furs, weapons, exotic materials from afar. And they estimate that one grave had beads that took 10,000 hours of work. So there's an implied inherited status in these burials. So that contradicts the notion that hunter-gatherer groups are egalitarian because they had some sort of status. They also recently discovered Ice Age monumental architecture. Now, they never knew that before. They never gave people the credit during that time for wanting or thinking or being able to build gigantic architecture. So there's this place called Göbekli Tepe, where there are massive pillars 16 feet high and over a ton of rock that are elaborately carved. And the construction implies some sort of coordinated activity on a huge scale that would imply being at one spot for a while to work together. But these people were not farmers. They were hunters. So there you go, the notion of all farmers. In order to be collective, you had to be a farmer. That wasn't true either. And I just wanted to recommend this book, Göbekli Tepe, The Genesis of the Gods. And there's some mind-blowing photographs in here of the architecture. I mean, this is Ice Age stuff. Look at that. Really interesting. The location of this construction, and it's huge. I mean, it's like a whole complex. It's a city. Suggests it had some sort of astrological or chronological purpose. And how did supposed hunter-gatherers, because they knew they were, evolve to do major public works would require a complex social hierarchy? Are there a number of other instances where this would be true, or is this unique? Well, it's not unique. There are other places. So between 25,000 and 12,000 years ago, public works have been discovered. The remains of circular structures 39 feet in diameter with permanent aesthetics and permanent location, decorating, carvings, etc., were erected on a framework of mammoth tusks and bones. And the bones were arranged in patterns that go way beyond function. They're really striking to look at. They're decorative. So there's evidence of wooden enclosures of 130 feet in length. Not big as the Colosseum, but for their time period, they required an amount of cooperative design and labor that we, up until now, said did not exist. They're completed to commemorate what? Why? I mean, what were they for? Were they commemorating mammoth hunting? The amount of bones they said that were there were enough meat to feed hundreds of people for months. And in other areas, they found evidence of exchange of amber and beads and shells and pelts over huge distances. So why is there evidence of monument building, trade, craft in the Far Ice Age that's supposed to have no social complexity? Of course, now some reject 100% egalitarian ideas and say, look, this is proof that people were always competitive and self-aggrandizing and used coercive power and had hierarchical cultures. And the fact that the evidence is patchy might suggest that the behavior was patchy, and that rather than a period of time with hunter-gatherers that evolved into a period of time with farming, etc., perhaps they coexisted. This is the big breakthrough. This is the really interesting thing. Perhaps they coexisted. And therefore, people are not inherently egalitarian or unjust, that different things happened all at the same time. Many experts still want to see early people as stupid savages. But in 2014, somebody called Yuval Harari wrote a book called Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. And I have a quote here that I want to read. The sociopolitical world of the foragers is another area about which we know next to nothing. Scholars cannot even agree on the basics, such as the existence of private property, nuclear families, and monogamous relationships. It's likely that different bands had different structures. Some may have been as hierarchical, tense, and violent as the nastiest chimpanzee group, while others were as laid back, peaceful, and lascivious as a bunch of bonobos. So bands were basically ape-like, is what this person is saying. And that implies that for millennia we had modern brains, but we chose to live like apes. Or that we were able to overcome simian instincts and organize in diverse ways, only we didn't choose that. Which is it? We don't know. Neuroscientists say we are usually on autopilot, that there's a window of consciousness that's open about 7 seconds at a time for people to be self-aware, and the rest of the time we're in some sort of somnambulant state, except when we're engaged in dialogue, that human thought is inherently dialogic. In other words, we have a conversation going in our heads all the time, and that's why the ancients wrote books in the form of dialogues, because they were having conversations with themselves. We in the West gave up dialogue in philosophy when we began to think of people as rational and self-conscious by default. And, now neuroscientists are saying, well, no, actually, we're not rational or self-conscious. We're sort of dopes, we're sort of spaced out most of the time on automatic pilot. The ancients believed that it took years and years of meditation and isolation to become self-aware, that this wasn't something that came naturally to people. Political consciousness was thought to be achieved in enlightenment, that humans before that acted on tradition or on the will of God, and that during the age of enlightenment, somehow the light bulb went on overhead. Even rebels claimed to be acting on divine inspiration. God told us to revolt. In contrast, the Wendat nation of North America saw society as a confederation created by conscious agreement and constant renegotiation. In the 19th and 20th century, Europeans and Americans argued that primitive folk are not capable of political self-consciousness, nor of conscious individual thought. They debated this back and forth. They lived in a logical mentality or a mythological dream world, and mindless conformists were mindless conformists and were bound to traditions that were incapable of critical thought. Today, scholars reject this theory and say that it's lip service to the psychic unity of mankind, but no, it doesn't really exist. But still, people write their theories treating all early societies the same way without having independent thought. We still dismiss the people of prehistory as kind of halfwits. not able to come up with logical debate or anything like that. The evidence of more complex hunter-gatherer societies are a step up, but they're no proof of anything in some people's minds. There are some rare differing opinions about this. So in 1927, there was a guy called Radin who wrote Primitive Man as a Philosopher. He studied the Winnebago and others, and he was considered a real oddball because he maintained that these cultures tolerated eccentrics and rejected coercion. And white people did not want to believe this, even though this is in the 1920s. A Winnebago might reject traditional gods and create his own, and other people in his group would let him do that, and they might privately worry that the gods were going to punish him, but they didn't feel they needed to punish him. You were allowed to have contradictory beliefs, and they would never force conformity. In the early 20th century, the Nuev of South Sudan had leaders and priests, and these were often the weirdos of the tribe, or the oddballs, the eccentrics, sometimes a woman, or somebody who was mentally challenged, or a person that had physical deformities, or a cross-dresser. The more eccentric you were, the more likely you were to be a political leader. I think that might still be true. The seriously unorthodox, they believed, had been touched by God, which gave them special leadership qualities. So these are just ideas that are tossed around, take it or leave it. Some historians fall on that side of the argument and others don't. Then there's a guy called Claude Levi-Strauss who wrote The Savage Mind. He was a 20th century anthropologist who believed that early humans were our intellectual equals. Shook people up. He also wrote about politics, although he was an anthropologist. In 1944, he studied the politics among the Nambiquara, who were in Brazil. They were part-time farmers, and they had a very rudimentary culture, and he studied them and kind of studied them like he was looking at a Paleolithic culture. But, you can't say that. Strauss said, no, looking at them, they're not Paleolithic. They've been tainted by proximity to modern times. They're a modern group. They might give us a hint about the Paleolithic. Their social organization, it's not a look at past people. It's a look at more general features of the human condition, and especially politics. These people were very averse to competition. They had very little wealth. They didn't have chiefs. They appointed the job of chief, and kind of like a similar political position where it could come and go. It wasn't a hierarchical or traditional chief. They position attracted similar types to our politicians, people who liked prestige, who were eager to assume responsibility, that some people who just felt the job was its own reward. But they could not be as much wheeler-dealers as our politicians are, because the people simply did not have a difference in wealth and status. But this is the interesting thing about this group, and this really sets the tone for the rest of this book. This group lived two completely different cultures in the course of a year. In the rainy season, they lived on hilltop villages and practiced horticulture. In the rest of the year, after the rains, they broke into small foraging bands in which chiefs played an important role, and they took care of the unexpected crises of what was then a nomadic life. They abandoned the villages. During village life, there was much less authoritarianism. In fact, they spent a lot of time inviting people to join their village because they wanted to increase their group. But they never imposed anything on anybody. So they As a people, they effectively move between two social developmental stages if you go by the idea of a hierarchical evolutionary development of society, from forager to urban dwellers. These people, sometimes they were foragers, sometimes they were in agriculture and they were sedentary. So this shook anthropologists. They were consciously political, balancing personal ambition with the common good all the time, because they knew that either they were going to have to control crises when they were migrating, or they were going to be back at home with not any more power, just one of the guys, and they would have to get along with everybody. So there was this constant balance. Strauss continued to talk about similarities in early societies while everyone else continued with the Turgot belief of this hierarchical thing. Now, Strauss was saying, now wait a minute, if these people could live with two different kinds of cultures at the same time, why wouldn't that happen in the past? Of course it did. So there's overwhelming evidence that in Neolithic time, seasonal variations in social structure occurred, and that very anomalous individuals got treated with respect and played important political roles. There's evidence that both these things were true. Interesting fact is that many of the burials that they used to believe were signs of nobility, they now think show signs of congenital deformities or oddities, like very tall people like giants, or very small people, people with dwarfism, or people with hunchbacks, or other kinds of deformities. Maybe the ones that didn't have obvious conditions had conditions like epilepsy or albinoism, or, maybe there's more going on here than we ever originally thought. We could say one thing for sure, that these individuals were almost all physically unusual. So it may not be a sign of hereditary elitism, because why would a noble line be almost entirely comprised of dwarves and giants and hunchbacks and people with crippling deformities and defects in their skeletal system? Their burial is not necessarily an indication of how they may have been treated in life. Were others simply not buried at all? In most Paleolithical groups, the dead were, this is gross, they were defleshed, broken up, curated, or even processed into jewelry and artifacts. Ugh. So it seems that these particular buried bodies were contained, and they're beginning to notice now that these burial sites, the bodies are contained. Either they have huge heaps of rocks put on top of them, or underground they're closed with wooden planks or stones, or they're tightly bound, and they wonder, were they afraid of these people? Were they buried like this because they were afraid they were going to come back, that they were dangerous? Now, they 100% admit that this is speculation, but this is how historical, anthropological, archaeological theory evolves. People speculate, and then they look for more evidence. So anyway, all the Ice Age groups that have odd burials and monumental architecture had seasonal differences. And they were in foraging bands for a part of the year, and in concentrated settlements in another part of the year. They seemed to migrate with the herds and then stay near the fish runs and the nut harvests at a different time of year. So it's pragmatic, totally pragmatic. At Göbekli Tepe, activity at the construction was during a time when the gazelle herds congregated in the area, and there's evidence of huge quantities of nuts and wild cereals that were processed at the site. So was it an area of festive labor and an overabundance at that part of the year? Stonehenge was built as a giant calendar, among other things, for the midsummer to the midwinter, but it was built when they had returned to the area to harvest hazelnuts, and they abandoned cultivating cereal grains because they had done that in the passed. They abandoned it, but they did keep hogs and cattle. So our theories may be completely wrong. In nearby during wells in the winter, they stayed in the villages, and they abandoned the villages in the summer. So there you go. Part of the time they were sedentary, part of the time they were migratory. There's evidence that Neolithic England went from migrating and farming to back to seasonal migrating. And why? It appears that stores and animals came from very far. Stones and animals came from very far. So there was much social cooperation with larger groups. So they were interacting with other groups. Levi Strauss believed that this sort of a culture had political freedom, that this was an accepted idea around World War II. They called it the double morphology, that old cultures did this, and it seemed to lose favor and it's not really believed anymore. But it shows that earliest people experimented with social structure, and that they could change, and that they could go back and forth and back again. In 1903, Seasonal Variations of the Eskimo is a book by a guy called Marcel Mauss and Henri Bochat, which cracked me up because Maus, M-A-U-S-S, I think in German means mouse, and Bochat in French means handsome cat. Just cracked me up when I saw that. I thought, is this really their names? But apparently it was. So they studied the circumpolar Inuit, and they had two social structures, one for the summer and one for the winter. And interestingly enough, depending on which social structure they were in, which season they were in, they had two completely different systems of law and religion. In the summer, they lived in bands of 20 or 30. They caught freshwater fish and caribou and reindeer, and they would have one male elder. They had private property, and it was very possessively marked, and they had patriarchs. It was coercive and tyrannical, with power over their kin. In the winter, when the seals and the walruses flocked, they built huge communal meeting houses out of wood and whale ribs and stone, and became completely into the virtues of equality, altruism, and collective life. All wealth was shared. Spouses were traded under the aegis of Saria, the goddess of the sea. Other polar groups facing identical environmental situations as the Inuit lived completely differently. So at the same time that this was going on, Franz Boas, the German ethnologist, researched the Kwakiutl of Canada and the Northwest Pacific coast. They lived in the wintertime in plank palaces. They had hereditary nobility and courts and commoners and slaves. They had potlatches, which were these huge parties. And in the summer, they were very hierarchical. In the summer, they broke into small fishing clans, much less formal in ranking. People used different names in the summer than they did in the winter. That's so interesting. Robert Lowy, an ethnographer, studied the Plains nations, the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Crow of Montana and Wyoming. The Plains natives used to be cereal farmers, and they abandoned that with redomestication, and they escaped redomestication of escaped Spanish horses. So they were staying in one place, and they were growing cereals, and then they caught these horses, and it gave them mobility, and they said, well, farming's too hard. So they adopted a nomadic lifestyle. They became small, mobile bands. And in the late summer and the early autumn, the Cheyenne and Lakota would form large settlements to prepare for the buffalo hunt. And they appointed a police force that only worked at this one particular time. They had full coercive powers. They could imprison people, whip them, fine them. Anyone who endangered the hunt could get in trouble. They were unequivocally authoritarian, but it was strictly seasonal. and temporary. After the hunt, they had a big sun dance, and after that, they had anarchic organization and small mobile bands again. Modern evolutionists of the 50s and 60s thought in terms of the evolving growth of hierarchies, the band to the gardener to the farmer to industry, with the accompanying growth in economics. And these people defy that. And there's lots of them, and there's lots of evidence that it didn't happen that way. Plains Indians were keenly aware of the dangers of authoritarian power. I thought this was really interesting. Where are we here? Not only did they dismantle all means of exercising coercive authority the moment the ritual season was over, they were also careful to rotate which clan or warrior clubs got to wield it. Anyone holding sovereignty one year would be subject to the authority of others the next year. That was so interesting. Scholarship sometimes regresses. We knew this in the 1900s, and we got new theories in the 1960s and abandoned this total understanding for which there's evidence. So seasonal dualism defies the idea of simple or complex people, because all people were complex. It seems that no particular social order was fixed or immutable for many Ice Age ancestors. Institutional flexibility with rulers could exist for just a season. Pierre Calastris, the 1960s student of Levi Strauss, said the Amazonian chiefs had no real power. In the winter, they had tiny groups. In the summer, they lived socialistic lives. The poorest in the village were expected to... The chiefs became the poorest in the village because they were expected to give everything away for the benefit of everybody else, because they had to be role models. They also had to role model hard work. So being a chief was no treat. And they could have multiple wives, but there was a reason behind that, so that they could afford to and be able to organize these huge feasts that they were required to throw for the whole village. They needed many wives to make these feasts happen. And the wives had the freedom to take as many lovers as they wanted, so they weren't tied to the one chief. So it was sort of a social arrangement for the benefit of throwing parties. These people were all political. They created societies against having a state. They were against arbitrary power and domination, and they simply did not let those emerge. So Lowy, the student of Pierre Strauss, had argued that most indigenous people from Montreal in Canada and all the way down to Tierra del Fuego were anarchists. In other words, his point of view is that most Native Americans, all through North, all the way down to South America, resisted the notion of any kind of leadership at all. And the typical chief was a pacifier, not a lawgiver. And seasonality is confusing. Different cultures switched authority from the winter to the summer. And this didn't just happen in America. In Central Africa, they're egalitarian all year in this one particular set of tribes, except that they trade months, so that one month the men are in charge, the next month the women are in charge, then the men, then the women, and they change it cyclically all through the year. The only consistency is that seasonality existed everywhere, but how you defined it depended on the individual tribes. So how do we get stuck in a hierarchy with authoritarianism? What happened to us? So we have vestiges still of the seasonality. We have things like the giving season, the holiday season, vacation time. In Europe, in a lot of countries in Europe, people flee the cities. They close everything down and they flee in the summer, and they go to vacation, les vacances, for weeks and weeks. And then there's Carnival, May Day, Queen for a Day. And these seasonal rituals allow people to imagine a different social and political structure, and they foster a sense of political consciousness in people. They force them to think about, hey, what if the king were a slave for the day? That kind of attitude. So our ancestors were our intellectual peers. They grappled with political and social ideas as we do. They experimented. They were equally perceptive. They were equally confused. So why did we let permanent and intractable systems of inequality take root? So chapter 4, Free People and the Origins of Cultures and the Advent of Private Property. So especially in Europe, there have been odd traditions that are not understood that occur every year. And we've often said, well, what are these, like leftover pagan ideas, and or superstition, or pragmatically using folklore to make money. And people would disguise themselves as plants, as the green men, or they disguise themselves as animals, straw bears. They were just these traditions, and where did they come from? So today we have a few holidays that give us a small break. I mean, the week between Christmas and New Year's is a pretty good leftover. I mean, it's not much. People still go to work, but there's certainly a sense of nobody's really doing much. So today's festive calendars are just echoes of a time when societies did seasonal reconstruction and reassembling. And we don't know a lot about Paleolithic cultures, what their languages, their myths, their theologies, their rituals were, but we do know that they used remarkably similar tools and musical instruments and figurines and ornaments and funeral rites all over Europe across huge distances. And from looking at modern Aboriginal tribes, only 10% of hunter-gatherer groups were family groups. They had a mixed DNA. They traveled thousands and thousands of miles, and clans were scattered far and wide. So the point that they're making is, within a clan, relationships were not necessarily familial, but between clans, a particular family clan could find fellow family in clans thousands of miles away, that they were in pockets. There was long distance organization. I mean, they knew they were there and they connected, and society in that way spanned continents. And improvements in travel coincided with an increased population density. So despite easier movement, people moved around less. So even though they invented cars and trains and airplanes, we spend less time moving around. We might go once someplace much farther, but they moved far more than we do in a given year. Around 12,000 BC, Mesolithic post-glacial cultures diversified to include fishers and gatherers, but not hunters. And technological innovations indicate that there were suddenly, all of a sudden, they came up with these new ways of preparing food: slicing, dicing, grating, grinding, cooking, and cuisine was invented. I've often wondered, I mean, who figured out how to make bread? Who figured out that you had to knead it and put yeast in it, and had to be a certain temperature, and it needed sugar? I mean, it's way more trouble than it's worth with a book in front of you telling you how to do it. Who the heck figured it out the first time? It just blows my mind. So we can extrapolate a change in regional dress and regional hairstyle and art techniques. But overall, the direction of history was different everywhere and opposed to globalization. As groups settled, differences grew. And tribes still spread around areas much larger than modern nation states, much larger. The peoples of one group would be spread much farther. Local cultural worlds formed and made seasonal dispersal less and hierarchy more likely. So what is egalitarianism? We know what it's not. Egalitarianism means there's no hierarchy, no domination, no exploitation. It refers to the presence in a culture of an ideal, that the people of a group have the belief that they ought to be the same in ways that matter, and that this is realized. So they agree that paramount values be distributed equally amongst the members of the group, but they don't agree on what those values are. What is valuable? You need a universal objective standard to measure equality, and you can't get that with different cultures, because what's considered fair and equal in one culture is not fair and equal in another culture. And it's usually, therefore, been based on property, because hunter-gatherers didn't own land. So humans are distinct for producing more than they really need, and this cultural excess became a source of inequality. It's dangerous. It is very creative, but it causes problems. When there's a surplus, then there's a battle to get the surplus. The ruling classes were those who figured out how to organize society so they got the most. And modern anthropologists say the only way to have a true egalitarian society is to have no surplus. James Woodburn was an English anthropologist who studied egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies in Africa, Malaysia, India, and today. And this includes gender and age equality. They share everything, and they have no surplus. They call them immediate return economics, that food's brought home and it's eaten that day, and they don't keep the extra. The extra's shared, they don't preserve it or store it. And that's in opposition to delayed return, which are pastoralists and farmers. Those are people who keep animals and eventually slaughter them, or grow stuff and store the produce. They invest their energies in projects that bear fruit later in the future. And this can be it can lead to exercising power. The secret societies, rather, that he studied understood this. They knew that they had an actuarial intelligence, and therefore they kept no surplus because they wanted to avoid fighting over the excess. They organized lives to avoid the chains of captivity. And this only works in simple societies, but does this mean we're stuck? Does this mean there's no hope for us? And he contrasts this with Native Americans, who didn't believe that wealth could be translated into systems of inequality of power. They pointed to the failure of Europeans to provide mutual aid and to protect personal liberties. Eleanor Leacock is a feminist anthropologist who says egalitarian societies were less interested in equality and more in autonomy. So it wasn't about everybody having the same. It was about everybody being able to define their own agency. Native American women were less concerned with male-female equality, and were more about whether or not women could make their own decisions without male interference. That was freedom. Free people, each person has equal consequence and submits only when it pleases that person. Equality is individual liberty. The Wendat could choose to obey the chiefs or not. They had true equality, liberty. We have formal freedoms. We can travel if we have money. We don't have to obey anyone unless it's, the law, or we need a job. But the Wendats had what's called substantive freedom. They had pretend chiefs and real freedom. We have formal freedom. We have real chiefs and play freedom. So mutual aid was considered by the Wendats to be a necessary condition for personal autonomy. We call that communism. Seemed to work for them. There's such a thing as a theatrical hierarchy, leaders who are leaders in name only, which the natives seem to have. They were called the chiefs, but nobody had to obey them. The Nur of Africa had aristocrats with war captive slaves, and rank determined the ability to get cattle to use for marriage trade, marriage gave paternity claims and the ability to become an ancestor. So they had equality, but if it meant something to you to become an ancestor after you died, then you have to work backwards from that. You have to be able to make claims of paternity so that somebody's left to call you an ancestor. And in order to have claims of paternity, you have to have a formal marriage. In order to have a formal marriage, you have to get cattle. And rank determined your ability to get cattle. And it existed, but for some people in that society, they didn't care if they were ancestors or not. But no other power went along with this. You couldn't make others obey you, and you had no other special privileges. But we keep returning to this question. How did the control of property become the power to command other people? In the 1750s, this was looked at from the perspective of labor and work. There was a commercial society with a complex division of labor. You had sacrifice liberty to increase your wealth. That they just assumed that that was true. And with the Industrial Revolution, suddenly people were expected to work much longer hours than they had ever worked before, 12 to 15 hours a day of work. People believed in technical progress, and they embraced that, but it didn't really liberate people. Liberation from unnecessary toil was what was supposed to come from technical progress, and the science of the future would free us from work. So why in the 1880s were unions fighting to go from 14-hour-a-day to 8-hour-a-day work days? The Victorians claimed that early people struggled and worked all day for survival until it was discovered in the 1950s that this actually wasn't true, and that originally people had it backwards, that as things became more technological, people were doing more work, and that earlier hunter-gatherer and forager societies spent probably about 2 to 4 hours a day working. That they only worked to subsist because they didn't accumulate wealth, because they didn't care about those things. They weren't their values. They had access to everything that they needed. They all worked together for as much as they needed, and they were happy and comfortable. And after that, they couldn't be bothered. And in fact, the average medieval serf worked less than 9 to 5 every day. They worked fewer hours than we do. Hazelnut gatherers and cattle herders of the Stonehenge era worked less than that. And most worked 2 to 4 hours a day, and they sat around making music and stories and gabbing, socializing. Planting seemed like way too much work for a lot of these cultures. They understood that plants, they understood how wild plants grew, and they were able to take advantage of the plants in the wild rather than labor-intensive farming, which was tilling the soil and taking the rocks out and putting in fertilizer and, and pulling weeds and cultivating them and then reaping them. And I mean, it was just way too much work, so they didn't do it. Settling and farming had terrible costs in an increased number of hours of labor, in poverty and disease and war and slavery, and in endless competition and the pursuit of wealth and power. Our rejection of farming was a conscious choice, and so was our embrace of it, and it can be seen in earlier cultures. Every new technological breakthrough causes more unexpected hardships, things that we hadn't anticipated. Salin, this researcher, admitted that he was guessing that most early humans lived this way, but probably not. He said that probably the original affluent society may have been one way to live, but that there were other societies living equally contentedly, but not by that definition affluent, and living in a completely different way in parallel with that. So not all early societies valued leisure over hard work, and not all valued possessions, but some did. in Northwest California, the foragers were very greedy and organized their lives around accumulating shell money and sacred treasures and had stringent work ethic. In the Canadian Northwest, the fishers were highly stratified, very industrious, and the Kwakiutl of Vancouver Island were quite hierarchical. And I'm going to stop here because it's about enough time, and we'll get into a discussion of these two contrasting cultures. They're very interesting, and it shows you how right next to each other in juxtaposition, one above the other, one more northerly of the other, were these two completely different societies living at the same time, which tosses everything in contemporary historical theory about hierarchical evolution of societies right out the window. So that's it for now. I'm going to take a break for a while, so you guys enjoy these 3 videos, and we'll see what I feel like later whether I do another one. Thank you very much for watching. Sláinte and slán go fóill.